Well, good evening, everybody. You see, I've got my mask on here that Jennifer was so kind to make for me, and my wife has one as well. So I hope everybody has a mask that they can wear because, as I said, I have some exciting news for you. I know I was excited as Dave and Rich and I began to talk about it in a couple of days, or a couple of days ago. We began to talk about what our meetings are going to look like when we start up. And right now, we are planning for May 3rd, assuming that nothing happens to change that. On May 3rd, we are going to have an assembly to worship God at 9:30. I'd like to say like normal, but won't be exactly like normal. There will be some adjustments. We won't be doing Bible classes initially as we come back together. But the plan is to get together with however many fit the criteria to come and meet. And I'm going to send out more details in an email tomorrow. But what we're going to do is get a head count of everybody who's going to be able to make it next week. So not this coming Sunday, but a week from Sunday. And we are going to kind of socially distance all of the chairs, and we'll set aside chairs for every family in our group, along with setting aside some for visitors. We'll post things on our website, on Facebook, to alert even visitors to let us know that they would like to come, how many they have, so we could set aside a space for them. We are going to try and be responsible as the phase 1 recommendations by the CDC have recommended, and they have said, churches can meet again if they adopt social distancing measures. And so there will be a number of them that we do, and there'll be a number of things we do a little differently. But one of the really good things we'll do, because we'll still have a number of our members, because of certain health situations, or they're sick, that won't be able to make it. We're still going to have a number of our members who won't be able to show up. And so we're going to live stream pretty much the way this is tonight and the way Sundays have worked. But unlike on Sundays, when we've been having to click a lot of different links to watch different things and follow along different songs, we're going to live stream really the whole service. At least that's the plan so far. And for myself and Mindel, we'll work on getting that set up so that it works well for everybody. I don't know if the very first one will be as good as it will be a little bit later, because our hope is to buy some extra cameras for the building and be able to do this not only in the short term of getting back into services again, but even long term, continuing to live stream our services on YouTube and have the videos and have the services there after the fact. So anyway, I'll send out a lot more of the details tomorrow in an email. So look for that. If you don't see it, I will get it out tomorrow, probably sometime in the morning. And if you don't see it by the end of the day tomorrow, look in your spam for the details that it contains. Maybe if you have questions, feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email, a text, or anything, and we'll try and answer your questions and deal with any kind of recommendations as well. So I'm excited about that. I hope you are as well. We won't, I think I already mentioned, we won't be doing Bible classes, so it'll just be a service. And then we'll, close it up. And on Wednesdays, so a couple of Wednesdays from now, we'll be doing this again, but we'll be doing it from the building, ideally. We probably in the first phase, as we return, will not be having children's classes or any other classes other than just the auditorium. But down the road a little bit, we'll begin to expand those as, the recommendations come in and whatever, happens in terms of society and recommendations. We will keep adjusting it, ideally until in a fairly short order that we are able to operate in a way that we really want to, and to do all the things that we desire to do. So with that in mind, for tonight, we're going to continue to look at the reflections of an old man, my thoughts on Ecclesiastes. We're going to be looking in chapter 3 tonight. And as I titled this Reflections of an Old Man, because that's essentially what the book is. It's laid out that way from the very beginning. Solomon essentially saying, listen, I'm going to preach to the congregation, and I am going to tell you everything that I have learned through all of my life now that I'm an old man. And I am going to give you some insight to things about life that he had learned. And so for you and I, this is one of the great, when we're younger, we get a chance to really learn from an incredibly wise man, and not just a normal wise man, but a wise man who was given God-given miraculous wisdom of understanding, and his ability and insight into life and how it fits with people who want to be godly. And so in the first chapter, as he calls himself the speaker of the assembly, that's he starts off with his thesis statement of all is empty, all is vain. And I describe it as like, to me, it sounds like running on a treadmill that never ends. And you kind of wish you could get off, but you can't get off because there's no stopping it. And that is what life on the earth is like, unless we have some perspective. He doesn't give us that perspective in the beginning. It ends with that perspective, the book does, and it gives us some moments along the way, and we'll run into one of them tonight, See, I've got a question here. Are you guys seeing the video? Because Debbie just said, are we still waiting? I'm not sure. So somebody just note, if you get this, just put in there, try hitting back and reloading. So is anybody receiving the stream? Anyway, I hear the stream going on in my front room, so I'm going to keep going, and hopefully the Crutchfields get theirs going. So, get myself back to where I was. As we talk about understanding that life is without God is just like a never-ending cycle that you almost feel like you want to get off. But there are some good things and some wonderful blessings that come with it. And now I've got everybody contacting me, so I appreciate all the texts, and I am not going to read whoever's text that is. I'm assuming Mendel's, because that's usually what he likes to do. But as I get back into the book itself, there are these moments in the book where he tells us what I talked about last week is the yeah, but. And in fact, going into all these things that he discovered were vanity in chapter 2, just indulging every desire and every whim, and then wisdom and just even wisdom, as wonderful as it might seem and might appear to be, is not the end-all be-all of life. Because no matter how much wisdom we attain, we will never get and attain the wisdom of God. And so we'll always be falling short in terms of wisdom. That's not going to solve all of life's problems. In fact, with it comes a great deal of sorrow and grief when we understand things, and we understand things as they are, and we have a really clear thinking of this world. It's not all roses. but that's okay. Wisdom is still better than the opposite, which is foolishness. But and then work itself, which is a good thing, but is not the end all be all of life. It too, if you are trying to make that some kind of grand purpose for your life, would be hollow, would be empty. And then the yeah, but, kind of the first one, comes in chapter 2 towards the end. And he says, the one who finds the good pleases God and is given wisdom and knowledge and joy by God. And so that he tells us that we need to find the good. We need to seek out the good and to do the good. And when we do that and we please God that way, that he gives to us wisdom, he gives us knowledge, and he gives us joy. And now understand, one of the things about God-given wisdom Solomon is not the only one to ever receive it. We're told to pray for wisdom, and we wouldn't be told to pray for wisdom if God does not grant it. And so we don't necessarily always know when he has. I don't know. I haven't gotten a bolt of lightning to tell me, oh, here came his wisdom. But the idea that God gives us the real blessings, that they don't come from the earth itself. They don't come from our own efforts to try and make everything work out just the way we would like. So let's move into chapter 3 here for tonight. And he tells us in the beginning, and this is a passage that I think lots of people will know, that life is seasonal. Everything is beautiful in its time. And I want to read through the first 11 verses and then come back and talk about them. He says, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing." We'll come back to that one in a moment. "A time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end." That last verse, let me just start there for a moment. He's put into us the concept of a beginning and an end that you and I can never fully know. Now that in some ways sounds almost cruel, but I think it's because he has given to us, we are created in his image, and so we have an understanding of an eternity, but because we have been born into this flesh, and we are limited by what we can see and understand and what God can instruct us with, we can't know everything he knows, even though we can understand it's there. And so this idea that we can't perceive all of it, but it's in us. We have an eternity in our heart. And I think even back to when I was an atheist, I had a really tough time with the concept that I would cease to exist completely. That it seemed weird that there's something about me. I could understand my flesh getting old and not working. I've had, surgeries, and I've had things cut out, and I've had things, repaired, and I've had, stuff done on me, different injuries for different kind of situations in life. But there still seems like no matter how much you cut from me, there's something about me that isn't just this, my flesh. And so the idea of that, whatever that is, just ending, was a really difficult leap for me, even when I was convinced that religion was a man-made construct. And so I think one of the things this passage really has always hit me with this idea that, wow, God put that in us, that we have a tough time seeing or even conceptualizing that we just won't exist anymore. And I think that's real. And I think that's God-given. Now, I want to come back into verse 11 and the line, everything is beautiful in its time. Not everything here is wonderful in its time. A time to die doesn't make it necessarily wonderful. It doesn't make it joyful. A time for war, sometimes it's the right time for war, but war is never going to be pleasant. It will always be difficult. There will be sacrifices and there will be hardships and there will be grief and sorrow. There will be lots of losers on all sides of that war, but it doesn't mean it wasn't the right time for the war. And so as he looks through all of this, and so sometimes we think about this idea of life being seasonal, and we think about that as kind of, spring is when we're, born, and then, we are from 20 to maybe 60 is, our summer and fall, and then the winter of our life, as we see it ending. But I don't think that's at all what he's talking about, that it isn't that, we go through, have these wonderful parts of the seasons, in different times of our lives. And there are some aspects to the times of our lives, things shift. But all of these things that he lists here can happen throughout our life when we're young and when we're old. Very often, it's common for a younger couple to maybe have this incredible joy at the birth of their children, and at the same time, or in that same time frame, be mourning the death of their grandparents or great-grandparents. And so that life has got both of these things in it. And I'm always remember this verse in verse 2, a time to be born, a time to die, because the day that Julie and I learned that she was pregnant, and it was really our last hope that we would ever have a child, is the exact day I learned it within hours of learning one of my best friends died. And so I had this really unusual day where it was a time for rejoicing and birth, but it was also a time of grief. And I had both of them in the exact same day. And that is the way of life. Life has both of those things in it. And so when we look at all of these things, and I was really struck today when I was reading it again, because this is a verse I don't have memorized very well. And that's verse 5 in the second half of it, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. So for all of you introverts out there, even when we start gathering together again, it will be a time to refrain from embracing. And so all those introverts who are loving that might be able to see people and talk to people from a distance. And I see you, Janae and Bailey, who don't want to touch anybody or have anybody touch you. And I understand it, being a fellow introvert myself. But there is a time, and even introverts understand this, that there is a time to have embracing. Now, some extroverts, they think every time is for embracing, and they do it all the time nonstop. And for you, I know this social distancing has been cruel and unusual punishment. But there is a time for both of them. And we are in a time that we are going to refrain from embracing for a while. I don't know how long that will be. I hope that they come up with some kind of vaccine and, 6 months from now, some kind of miracle happens. They keep saying a year to 18 months is probably best case. But that somewhere down the road, sooner rather than later, we won't even think about this any different than a flu, because anybody who is susceptible or in danger will have gotten a vaccine for it and had a shot, at least so that they wouldn't have to worry to the same extent people are now. And so when we think about all of these different things, some of these make us leap for joy, and some of them make us sorrowful and sad, but life needs both of them. And I was thinking about it this way today, and I was remembering and asking, and I wanted to ask all of you to remember this same thing. I would like you to try and remember the very best day of your life. Now, I can remember it, brings a smile, even brings a tear. So I remember the moment my daughter was born. But not every moment of life has been exactly that same moment. And nor could it be. It wouldn't be as special. If I had a daughter born every single day, besides being incredibly immoral, being unlikely and almost impossible, the idea of having that great thing happen every single day would lessen it. It would cease to be as important. And I actually remember a friend of mine, when his third or fourth child was born, I don't remember which, he didn't even make it back in time to his wife's room for the beginning of the birth. He was out getting some snacks and doing some things, and he really almost missed the birth completely. It was kind of like old hat. He didn't think much about it, and he's like, I got plenty of time. She takes forever, and all of a sudden he comes in and there she was. Like, well, that was easy, and it didn't have the same impact. Now, that doesn't mean the same child didn't have the same impact, but that day, that moment didn't have the same impact because it doesn't happen all the time. And that's what life is. It has ups, it has downs, it has seasons, because that's what makes it. If we had unending 100, degree days, I'm sure some of you out there would love it, Audrey, Julie, but the reality is that most of us get really tired of it. We might like it for a while, but then we're tired of it. We want to have some cool weather. We want to have some dew in the morning on the grass. We want to go up to the snow and play in that snow. Now, we also don't want it to be 20 degrees below zero every day and have to endure that all the time. So life and all of its seasons gives us its flavor. And I think we need to really be thankful to God for that. So I want to move on to the second point I want to make tonight, and that is the next yeah, but part that comes in the book of Ecclesiastes. And that starts in verse 12, and I'm just going to read 12 through 15, but I'm going to focus on 12 and 13. It says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. And so this idea that all of this toil, because that's kind of the question he asked in verse 9, is what gain is there from all this toil? And he said essentially this busy work that we have from God, it doesn't fulfill us. The toil itself is not the end all be all. But what is important to come from the toil and the work we do is to reap the good things from it. And so that's what verse 12 is really talking about. He says, he perceived there is nothing better for them than to be joyful. So to be joyful for what you have, not what you wish you could have, not what you idealize could have, but what do you have that you can be joyful about? Excuse me. I should have had some water here for me. Maybe Julie will hear this and bring me some in a moment. But anyway, he says, to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. See, there she is. I speak, and there she brings it. Thank you so much. And so, to have joy, to do good all of your life, but also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. Now, I just put this down here as reaping. We need to reap from what we have done. We need to take a portion of that. God actually commanded it in the law of Moses to Israel. He told them, you take a tenth of all that you have produced and you set it aside for you and your family to rejoice for an entire week. There's a principle there that I think is important. He didn't tell them to take all of it. He didn't tell them to take none of it. He told them to take a portion of it. And he says you need to rejoice with it because it is the reward of the work that we do. And that we ought to be thankful and rejoicing in that. And that, he says, is God's gift to all of us. Now, I want to, here in a few more minutes, just kind of talk about the last section. And that is from dust to dust. Because he comes back, he's a little bit more into his this is all vanity and this is all worthless kind of mode. And he says, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. And in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. I said in my heart, with regard to the children of man, that God is testing them, that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. For what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? That's a question he doesn't answer. He simply goes, I don't know. He wasn't given that wisdom. He wasn't given that information. He has no idea what happens to the spirit of animals and the spirit of humans. Whether they go separate ways or not. And I'm not going to begin to expound upon something that even Solomon couldn't understand. And he says, so I saw that there is nothing better that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. And he's kind of referring back to what we talked about earlier. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? But I want to talk about this from dust to dust part for a moment, because he tells us that God is actually testing us, that we can understand something that we might not always understand, that we really are in many ways just like the animals. We know there is something about us that is different, but our flesh and blood is very similar to the flesh and blood of other animals, especially beasts of the earth. Not so much like fish, not so much like, bugs and insects and things. But when we look at mammals upon the earth, we see, wow, some of them are really similar to us, and some of them not as much. But we all come from the same thing. We are all from the dust, and all of us to the dust return. This made me think of something. I was watching a video yesterday, or maybe it was early this morning, of a doctor in LA describing or talking about this pandemic and the situation and kind of what everybody's dealing with. But he was talking about kind of a perspective. He's an older doctor, and he was talking about perspective. And he said, 100 years ago or more, lots of families would have, a mother might give birth to 6, 8 children, and might only 4 of them live to see adulthood. And that was normal. They understood death was part of life, that it was everywhere around them, that they couldn't leave it, they couldn't stop living because of death. They just kept going. And in our modern society, especially in our culture, we have essentially been so successful in taking death off to hospitals, and some of this I'm putting in my own words, off into hospitals and in nursing facilities, that it's not around us. We don't have our folks dying in our house often, like most families had last century. And so we have become a culture that is essentially tried to vaccinate itself from death. And so that we don't want it near us and we don't want to think about it. And that we are suffering to some degree a level of fear in all of this because, when I was looking at pandemics a few weeks ago, I was surprised that there was a terrible flu pandemic in this 67. I guess I would have been just a few years old. And one in 58 that had a really high death rate in those 2 flu seasons. Those were the 2 mentioned. They weren't as bad as the 1918 that most of you have probably heard about now, if you didn't already know about it. But we have kind of conditioned ourselves that death isn't part of life. And one of the things about this passage is that it really is. Death of this flesh, and our animals pass away, and very often we have our pets, and they don't last as long as we do. They don't last as long as our children do, so we have them only for a short time, and then we see them go, and that's tough, and it's like a family member passing away, and so we grieve and we have sorrow over it. And sometimes we want to, I can remember parents talking about it. They told their children, oh no, we took, dog so-and-so off to a wonderful, paradise where he could go run around on the farm all day, because they tried to separate death so that their kids wouldn't see it and wouldn't feel it. And it probably isn't healthy for us, because the scriptures never really give us that sense of trying to hide reality from us. And so we need to understand that we are beasts, and especially compared to God, and that really the very best we can do is to listen to Him and to try and do good with the time we have, with the talents and experience and the abilities we have, to try and find the joy every day in life around us, whatever might be there, and to reap whatever good comes from the effort that we have given in our lives. But remember that we will return to the dust, because that's an important point, especially as the book develops towards the end. And as I mentioned, I think a week or so ago, for young people, remembering that when we're young, that we're not immune from things, that we're not like, hey, nothing can happen to us, but we want to live with a zest and a zeal of being young, but also having some wisdom and understanding that this isn't all, that this isn't the end of all things, that there is something more that we can't yet see. And so I appreciate all of you for coming tonight. I'll send out the email informing everybody about our meeting in a couple of Sundays from now. And please respond to that either by text, email, or phone call, and let me know based on those criteria if you will be able to make it, because a couple of us will be setting up the chairs in a socially distancing way for all the different family groups that will be able to make it there. So let's have a closing word of prayer. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for your word. Thank you for the reminders that come from your word to be joyful and to be thankful and to know that we're going to have good times and bad times and that life is full of these seasons. And also help us to remember that this body won't last forever. Our time here won't last forever. We've only got so many days. Help us to remember that I've got a finite number of days left in my life to do something with, and that I can do some good with it, that one day I might rejoice with you in heaven with all those who loved you as well. We thank you, Father, for this time that we could do this. We thank you for all this technology that allows us in the midst of this quarantining to be able to communicate and to read through your word. And we look forward, though, Father, and we hope and pray that on May 3rd we will be able to gather again, even in a little slightly different way, to rejoice with one another and to partake of the Lord's Supper together, to sing songs of praises to you and to pray to you. And we hope, Father, and we look forward to that day that we can do that again. We thank you for this time and for all that you have given to us. We thank you for your Son. In his name we pray. Amen.